Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for nearly 2 decades, and he thought he had developed an unshakable professional composure. He had navigated every kind of situation imaginable, from hilarious wrong answers to deeply emotional family stories, from contestants who fainted to surprise proposals, and through it all he had maintained the perfect balance of humor and heart that had made him one of television's most beloved hosts. But on that humid August afternoon in 2025, a 93-year-old man named Arthur Brennan would make a confession so shocking, so completely unexpected, that Steve would stop the show entirely. The cameras would keep rolling on something that transcended entertainment, and everyone watching would be forced to confront questions about morality, justice, guilt, and redemption that had no easy answers. 2 families stood ready to compete, the Martinez family from Texas and the Brennan family from New Jersey. The Brennan family immediately drew attention because at their center stood Arthur Brennan, a frail man who looked every one of his 93 years, with thin white hair, deeply lined face, and hands that trembled as they gripped his walker. His family surrounded him protectively, 4 generations including his daughter who was in her late 60s, his grandchildren in their 40s, and his great-grandchildren who ranged from teenagers to young adults. Arthur had barely spoken during the pre-interview, letting his family answer most questions, but there was something in his eyes, a haunted quality that the producers noticed but couldn't quite identify, that suggested this quiet old man was carrying something heavy. The Brennan family won their game with strong teamwork, though Arthur contributed little, seeming distracted and distant even as his family celebrated around him. As they lined up for fast money, Arthur's daughter Karen gently suggested that maybe her son David should play instead of Arthur, concerned that the pressure might be too much for her elderly father. But Arthur shook his head with surprising firmness and said, "I need to do this. I need to be up there." Something in his tone made Karen back down, and Arthur's grandson went first, scoring 189 points, which meant Arthur needed only 11 points to win the $20,000. It should have been the easiest fast money round imaginable, virtually impossible to lose, but as Arthur approached the podium, leaning heavily on his walker, Steve noticed that the old man was crying, not the happy tears of excitement that Steve sometimes saw from emotional contestants, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook Arthur's thin frame and made it clear that something was profoundly wrong. Steve's smile faded immediately, and he approached Arthur with concern, asking, "Sir, are you all right? Do you need to sit down? Do you need us to stop for a minute?" Arthur shook his head and said in a voice that was surprisingly strong despite his tears, "No, Mr. Harvey, I need to do this now. I need to say something before I play this game, before we win this money, because if I win it without telling the truth first, it will be blood money, and I can't take blood money with me to my grave." The studio went completely silent, that particular profound silence that happens when people sense something significant and possibly terrible is about to be revealed. Steve's face showed confusion and concern, and he looked at the producers who were equally bewildered, but something in Arthur's demeanor, the weight of whatever he was carrying combined with his obvious determination to speak, made Steve nod slowly and say, "Okay, sir. Whatever you need to say, we're listening." Arthur turned to face his family, his face contorted with pain, and then he turned to the audience and the cameras. What he said next would stop the show completely, would ultimately require legal consultation, would spark intense ethical debates, and would force everyone involved to grapple with questions about confession, atonement, and whether some truths are better left buried. Arthur said, "My name is Arthur Brennan, I'm 93 years old, and I killed someone when I was 21 years old. I've never told anyone. I've carried this secret for 72 years, and I need to confess it before I die, because the weight of it is crushing me, and because the man I killed deserves to have his death acknowledged, even if it's 72 years too late." The gasps that went through the studio were audible and immediate, shock rippling through the audience, the crew, and most visibly through Arthur's own family. His daughter Karen went white, her hand flying to her mouth, and she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Dad, what are you talking about? This isn't funny." But Arthur wasn't joking, his face showed only anguish and determination as he continued, "I'm not confused. Karen, I know exactly what I'm saying. In 1953, when I was 21 years old and stationed in Germany with the army, I killed another soldier. It wasn't in combat, it wasn't an accident, and I covered it up. His death was ruled a suicide, and I let everyone believe that lie for 72 years. But it wasn't suicide. I killed him, and I need everyone to know the truth. Steve Harvey stood frozen, his expression showing a complicated mix of shock, confusion, and something that looked like horror. He looked at the producers, who were frantically talking into their headsets, clearly trying to figure out what to do with a confession of murder being broadcast live on a game show. Steve turned back to Arthur and said carefully, "Sir, I think maybe you need to stop talking right now. I think maybe you need to speak with a lawyer before you say anything else." But Arthur shook his head firmly and said, "I don't need a lawyer, Mr. Harvey. I'm 93 years old, I'm dying of cancer, and I have maybe 3 months left to live. Whatever legal consequences might come from this confession, they don't matter anymore because I won't live long enough to face them. What matters is that I finally tell the truth about what I did, that I acknowledge this man's death, and that I try to make whatever amends are possible even though it's far too late." He looked directly at the camera and said, "The man I killed was named James Crawford. He was 20 years old, from Georgia, and he died because of me on March 15, 1953. His family has spent 72 years believing he killed himself, and they deserve to know the truth." The studio was in chaos now, producers rushing onto the stage, Steve trying to figure out what to do, Arthur's family in various stages of shock and horror, and the audience sitting in stunned silence. Steve made a decision that would later be debated extensively. He signaled the producers to keep the cameras rolling and said, "Stop the show. Stop everything. This has become something other than a game show, and we need to handle it appropriately." He turned to Arthur and said, "Sir, I need you to understand that what you're saying is being recorded, that it's potentially being broadcast, and that there could be serious consequences. Are you absolutely certain you want to continue?" Arthur nodded and said, "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I'm dying, Mr. Harvey, and I can't take this secret to my grave. I need to tell what happened. I need James Crawford's family to know the truth about how he died, and I need whatever accountability or consequences come from that, even if they come 72 years too late." The story Arthur began to tell took everyone back to 1953, to a military base in occupied Germany where young American soldiers were stationed in the aftermath of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. Arthur had been drafted in 1951, had done his basic training, and had been shipped to Germany in 1952 as part of the ongoing American military presence there. He was 20 years old, away from home for the first time, and struggling to adapt to military life and to the complicated social dynamics of a military base, where young men from all over America were thrown together in close quarters. James Crawford had arrived at the base a few months after Arthur, a 20-year-old from rural Georgia who was quiet, kept to himself, and who became the target of bullying and harassment from some of the other soldiers. Arthur didn't participate in the bullying at first, but he didn't stop it either, and he watched as James was subjected to increasingly cruel treatment, called names, had his belongings destroyed, was excluded from social activities, and was generally made miserable by soldiers who saw him as weak and different. Arthur paused in his story, tears streaming down his face, and said, "I need to tell you why James was bullied, because it's important to understanding what happened and why. James was gay. We didn't use that word then. We used much crueler words, but that's what he was. He never said it openly, never acted on it as far as I know, but somehow people knew or suspected, and in 1953 in the military, that made him a target. Being gay was illegal in the military then, could get you dishonorably discharged, and the culture was viciously homophobic in ways that young people today might not understand. James was tormented constantly, and I watched it happen and did nothing to stop it because I was a coward, and because I was afraid that defending him would make people think I was gay too." Arthur's voice broke as he continued, "On March 14, 1953, there was an incident. Some soldiers cornered James in the barracks and beat him badly, and when James threatened to report them, they threatened him back, said if he told anyone, they would make sure he was investigated for being homosexual, which would have meant dishonorable discharge and his life being destroyed. James didn't report the beating, but I could see he was breaking under the pressure. The studio was absolutely silent, everyone transfixed by this story from 7 decades ago. Arthur continued, his voice steady now as if telling the truth after so long was giving him strength. The next day, March 15th, I found James alone in one of the storage buildings on the base. He was crying, and when he saw me, he said he couldn't take it anymore, that he was thinking about deserting or maybe ending his life because he couldn't survive in the military, but couldn't go home either because his father would disown him if he was dishonorably discharged. I should have gotten help for him, should have reported what was happening, should have done something to protect him. But I was angry at James for being weak, angry at myself for being a coward, angry at the whole situation, and I said terrible things to him. I told him that he was pathetic, that he should stop feeling sorry for himself, that if he couldn't handle being a soldier, he should just do everyone a favor and stop wasting our time. I said cruel things that I knew would hurt him, and then I left him there alone. Arthur's hands were shaking violently now as he gripped his walker, and Steve had moved closer, ready to catch him if he fell. Arthur said, an hour later James was found dead in that storage building. He had hanged himself, or at least that's what everyone believed. There was a note that said he couldn't go on, that he was sorry, that it was better this way. The death was investigated briefly and ruled a suicide, and James's body was sent home to his family in Georgia with the official story that he had taken his own life due to difficulty adjusting to military service. His family was devastated, and because suicide was seen as shameful and because there was stigma around mental health, they were left to grieve in silence and shame, believing their son had killed himself. Arthur paused, took a shaking breath, and said, "But here's what I've never told anyone. After I left James in that storage building, I felt guilty about what I had said to him. I went back maybe 30 minutes later to apologize, and when I got there, I found him unconscious but still alive. He had tried to hang himself, but the rope had partially broken or the beam had shifted, and he had fallen. He was barely breathing, but he was alive. I could have saved him. I could have called for help, could have gotten medics there, could have cut him down and given him a chance to survive. But I didn't." The horror of what Arthur was saying settled over the studio like a physical weight. Steve's face showed complete shock, and Arthur's family members were crying and shaking their heads in disbelief. Arthur continued, his voice now barely above a whisper but still clear. "I stood there, and I looked at James lying on the ground barely breathing, and I made a choice. I decided that saving him would just prolong his suffering, that he would be investigated for attempted suicide, that his homosexuality would likely be discovered, that he would be dishonorably discharged and his life would be ruined anyway, and that maybe it was kinder to just let him die. So I did nothing. I stood there for several minutes watching him die, and then when I was sure he was dead, I staged the scene to look like he had succeeded in hanging himself, like he had never fallen, and there had been no chance to save him. I made sure the rope was secure, positioned his body to look like a completed suicide, and then I left and waited an appropriate amount of time before discovering the body and calling for help. Everyone believed it was suicide. No one suspected that I had been there, that I had watched him die, that I had chosen not to save him when I could have. The silence in the studio was complete and suffocating. Steve Harvey looked like he might be sick, his hand over his mouth, his eyes wide with shock. Arthur's daughter Karen was sobbing, saying over and over, "No, no, this can't be true." Arthur's grandchildren looked horrified, and some of them were backing away from him, as if they couldn't stand to be near him. Arthur looked at his family and said, "I'm sorry you had to learn this about me. I'm sorry I've been living a lie for your entire lives. But I couldn't die without telling the truth, without acknowledging what I did to James Crawford, and without trying to make sure his family knows that his death wasn't entirely his choice, that there were circumstances and actions that contributed to it, including mine." He turned back to the camera and said, "I'm speaking directly now to James Crawford's family, If any of them are still alive and if they ever see this, I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry. Your son, your brother, your loved one did try to take his own life because he was being tormented and saw no way out, but he didn't succeed initially, and I had the power to save him and chose not to. I let him die because I thought it was easier than dealing with the complicated aftermath of saving him. That was murder, maybe not in the legal sense, because I didn't actively kill him, but in the moral sense because I chose to let him die when I could have chosen to save him. I've lived with that choice for 72 years, and it has poisoned every day of my life. Steve Harvey found his voice and said, his tone a mix of compassion and horror, Mr. Brennan, I don't even know what to say right now. This is beyond anything I've ever dealt with. Why are you telling us this? Why now? Why here? Arthur looked at Steve with eyes that held 7 decades of guilt and said, because I'm dying, Mr. Harvey, and I can't face whatever comes after death carrying this secret. Because James Crawford's death was ruled a suicide and his family has lived for 72 years believing he chose to leave them, and they deserve to know that the truth was more complicated, that he was tormented and desperate, and that I failed him when he needed help. And because I've been a coward my entire life, Mr. Harvey. I was a coward when I didn't defend James from bullying. I was a coward when I let him die rather than deal with the complicated aftermath of saving him, and I've been a coward every day since by keeping this secret. I wanted to confess this while standing in front of people, while doing something public, because I knew if I tried to confess privately I would chicken out like I've chickened out 1,000 times before. This show, this public platform, it forced me to actually go through with it. Steve turned to the producers and said, we need to stop taping. This is a legal situation now, this is a confession of a crime, and we need to figure out what our responsibilities are here. But Arthur interrupted, please don't stop. Please let me finish. I need to say everything while I still have the courage. Steve looked torn, but he nodded, and Arthur continued. After James died, I was questioned briefly like everyone else on the base, and I lied to investigators. I said I hadn't seen James that day, hadn't talked to him, had no idea he was suicidal. The investigation was perfunctory because suicide among soldiers wasn't uncommon, and because no one cared much about investigating the death of a soldier who was suspected of being homosexual. James's death was filed away, forgotten by almost everyone except his family, and I went on with my military service, was eventually discharged honorably, came home, went to college on the GI Bill, got married, had children, built a career, and lived what looked like a normal, successful life. Arthur's voice became even more pained as he continued, but it wasn't a normal life, Mr. Harvey, because I carried James Crawford with me every single day. I saw his face when I closed my eyes. I heard his last struggling breaths. I felt the weight of the choice I made every moment of my life. I became obsessed with trying to atone, trying to balance the scales somehow. I volunteered with suicide prevention organizations. I donated money to LGBTQ full support groups. I tried to be kind and helpful to every person I met, all while knowing that nothing I did could undo what I had done to James. I married a wonderful woman, my wife Helen, who died 5 years ago, and I never told her about James. I raised 3 children who thought I was a good man, and I never told them that I had watched someone die and done nothing to save him. I've lived a lie for 72 years, been respected and loved by people who didn't know what I really was, and now I'm dying and I can't carry this anymore. Steve Harvey, who had been standing silently trying to process everything, finally spoke and said, Mr. Brennan, I need to ask you something. You said you've been volunteering with suicide prevention and supporting LGBTQ+ organizations. Was that genuine, or was it just about easing your guilt? Arthur considered the question and said, both, I think. The guilt motivated it, absolutely, but the work itself became genuine. I've helped save lives through suicide prevention work. I've supported young gay people who were struggling, and that work mattered and was real even if the motivation started from guilt. But you're right to question it, because how much does good work motivated by guilt really count? Can you atone for letting one person die by helping others live? I don't know. I've asked myself that question every day for 72 years and I've never found an answer that satisfies me. Karen, Arthur's daughter, finally spoke up, her voice shaking with emotion. "Dad, I can't process this. You're telling me you watched someone die? You let someone die who you could have saved. How could you live with that? How could you raise us, be our father, teach us right from wrong, when you were carrying this?" Arthur turned to his daughter, tears streaming down his face, and said, "I don't know, Karen. I told myself I was protecting you from the truth, that knowing about this would hurt you, but really I was just a coward who was afraid of losing your love and respect. I watched you grow up believing I was a good man, and I let you believe that lie because I was too weak to tell you the truth. I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry for lying to you your whole life." Karen was crying hard now, and she said, "I don't know if I can forgive you for this. I don't know if I can even look at you right now." Arthur nodded, accepting her anger, and said, "I understand. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I just needed you to know the truth before I die." Steve turned to the camera and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're in unprecedented territory here. This man has just confessed on national television to watching someone die and not helping them. I don't know what the legal implications of that are. I don't know if there's a statute of limitations on something like this, and I don't know what my responsibility is as the host of this show right now. But what I do know is that we've just witnessed something that goes way beyond entertainment, and we need to handle it with the gravity it deserves." He looked at Arthur and said, "Sir, what do you want to happen now? What were you hoping would come from this confession?" Arthur said, "I was hoping that somehow this would reach James Crawford's family, if any of them are still alive. I was hoping they would learn that James's death wasn't simple, that he was tormented and desperate, and that I failed him. I was hoping maybe I could apologize to them directly, even though I know that apology would be inadequate and 72 years too late. And I was hoping that confessing publicly would finally lift some of the weight I've carried, though I'm not sure that's actually happening. Mostly I just needed to tell the truth before I die, needed to make sure James Crawford's death was acknowledged, and that my role in it was known." The producers had called lawyers and were frantically trying to determine what their legal obligations were regarding Arthur's confession. It was determined that because the incident had occurred 72 years ago, and because Arthur had not actively killed James but had failed to render aid, and because it had happened on a military base overseas, the legal situation was incredibly complicated. There were questions about statute of limitations, jurisdiction, whether failure to render aid was even a crime in that context and at that time, and whether a dying 93-year-old man could or would be prosecuted for actions taken 7 decades earlier. But beyond the legal questions were profound ethical ones. Should this confession be broadcast? Did James Crawford's family have a right to know the truth, even if that truth was devastating? What responsibility did the show have to Arthur's family, who were now dealing with this shocking revelation? And what did it mean that Arthur had chosen to confess on a game show rather than through proper legal channels? Steve made a decision. He said, "Mr. Brennan, I think we need to stop the game show portion of this completely. This isn't about fast money or winning $20,000 anymore. This is about you trying to make peace with something you've carried for 7 decades, and about a man named James Crawford who died in 1953 and whose death deserves to be acknowledged. I'm going to make sure your family gets the $20,000 regardless, but more importantly, I'm going to help you try to find James Crawford's family, if they're still alive, and I'm going to give you whatever platform and resources you need to try to make whatever amends are possible, even though I know that nothing can really make this right." Arthur looked at Steve with something like gratitude and said, "Thank you, Mr. Harvey. I don't deserve your help, but I'm grateful for it." The taping stopped there, though cameras continued to roll as producers, lawyers, and Steve himself tried to figure out what to do next. Arthur's family was in crisis, some of them wanting to leave immediately, others wanting to stay and hear more, all of them struggling to reconcile the grandfather they thought they knew with this shocking revelation. The audience was shocked, having come for entertainment, and instead witnessing a confession of something that fell somewhere between murder and callous indifference. and Arthur himself seemed both relieved to have finally spoken his truth and terrified of the consequences that might follow. Over the next several days, as lawyers examined the situation and producers decided what footage could be aired, the show's research team worked to locate James Crawford's family. They discovered that James's parents had both died in the 1970s, never knowing the full truth about their son's death. But James had a younger sister, Mary Crawford Thompson, who was now 88 years old and living in Atlanta. She had spent her entire life believing her brother had committed suicide, carrying the shame and stigma that families of suicide victims faced in that era, and wondering why he had chosen to leave them. When the Family Feud team contacted Mary and explained the situation, her reaction was complicated. She was angry that the truth had been hidden for so long, devastated to learn that her brother might have been saved, and struggling to process that a man had watched James die and done nothing. But she also wanted to meet Arthur, wanted to hear the full story directly from him, and wanted to finally understand what had really happened to her brother 72 years earlier. A meeting was arranged at a neutral location, with cameras present but giving Arthur and Mary space to talk privately. The footage of that meeting would later be described as some of the most emotionally intense television ever captured. Mary, 88 years old and still grieving a brother she lost when she was 16, faced Arthur, 93 and dying, who had watched her brother's last moments and chosen not to save him. Arthur told Mary everything: the bullying James had faced, the beating he had endured, the desperation he had felt, the suicide attempt, and Arthur's choice to let him die rather than save him. Mary listened with tears streaming down her face, and when Arthur finished, she said something that shocked everyone. She said, "I forgive you." Arthur looked stunned, and Mary continued, "I don't forgive you because what you did was okay, because it wasn't. You let my brother die, and that was wrong, and I'm angry about it. But I forgive you because I'm 88 years old, because I've been carrying grief about James for my whole life, and because holding on to anger at you isn't going to bring him back. I forgive you because that's what my brother would have wanted, because James was kind and gentle and wouldn't have wanted me to spend my remaining years consumed by hatred. And I forgive you because you finally told the truth even though it took 72 years, and because you're clearly dying inside from the guilt of what you did." The conversation between Arthur and Mary continued for over an hour, with Mary asking questions about James's last days, about whether he had suffered, about whether he had mentioned her or their family, and Arthur answering as honestly as he could while crying almost continuously. Mary told Arthur about the life James never got to live, about their parents' grief and guilt over his death, about the questions that had haunted the family for decades, and about how the stigma of suicide had affected them all. She also said something that provided Arthur with a small measure of comfort. She said that learning the full truth about James's death, while painful, was actually better than the uncertainty and shame they had lived with, and that knowing James had been tormented and desperate made his suicide more understandable, and somehow less shameful than the unexplained suicide they had believed in. The meeting ended with Arthur apologizing again, and Mary saying she would pray for him, and the two elderly people embracing awkwardly, bonded by grief and guilt, and the ghost of a young man who had died 72 years earlier. The decision about what to broadcast was complicated and contentious. Some argued that Arthur's confession should not be aired, that it was too disturbing, and that it violated some unspoken boundary about what was appropriate for game show television. Others argued that the confession was newsworthy, that it shed light on historical military culture and the treatment of gay soldiers, and that Arthur had made the confession publicly with the intention of having it broadcast. Ultimately, after extensive legal review and consultation with Arthur, Mary, and both families, a special episode was created that included edited footage of Arthur's confession, his conversation with Mary, and extensive historical context about military culture in the 1950s, the treatment of gay soldiers, and the era's suicide rates and their relationship to societal stigma. The special was prefaced with content warnings and resources for suicide prevention and LGBTQ support, and it aired 3 months after the original taping. The response was intense and divided. Some viewers praised Arthur for finally telling the truth and felt his confession was an act of courage even if it came 72 years late. Others condemned him as a murderer who had lived a comfortable life while James Crawford remained dead and buried, arguing that his deathbed confession was self-serving and didn't constitute real accountability. Mental health professionals and LGBTQ advocates used the story to discuss historical persecution of gay people, the ways societal homophobia contributed to deaths like James's, and the importance of creating supportive environments where people in crisis can get help. Military historians and veterans discussed the culture of military bases in the 1950s, the toxic masculinity and homophobia that characterized that era, and how many similar stories might exist from soldiers who witnessed or participated in the persecution of gay service members. Arthur lived for 2 more months after the broadcast aired, dying in October 2025 at age 93. In those final months, he gave several interviews about his confession, always maintaining that while he couldn't undo what he had done, he was grateful to have finally told the truth, and to have been able to apologize directly to James Crawford's family. He also continued his work with suicide prevention and LGBTQ advocacy, using his story as a cautionary tale about the consequences of inaction and the lifetime weight of guilt. His obituary, which ran in major newspapers, mentioned his confession, describing him as a man who had carried a terrible secret for 7 decades and who had finally found the courage to speak truth before his death. The obituary divided readers, with some commending his final honesty and others arguing that he didn't deserve any praise for confessing to something so horrific. Arthur's family remained fractured by the revelation, with some members able to eventually forgive him and others unable to reconcile the grandfather they had loved with the young man who had watched someone die and done nothing. His daughter Karen gave a statement saying that she loved her father but was still processing the revelation and didn't know if she could ever fully forgive him, acknowledging that it was possible to love someone while also condemning their actions. Mary Crawford Thompson lived for another year after meeting Arthur, dying in 2026 at age 89. Before her death, she spoke publicly about her decision to forgive Arthur, explaining that forgiveness didn't mean excusing what he had done, but rather releasing herself from the burden of hatred. She said that learning the full truth about her brother's death had been painful but ultimately healing, that it had answered questions her family had carried for decades, and that it had allowed her to understand James's suicide in a broader context of persecution and desperation, rather than seeing it as an inexplicable failure. She established a scholarship in James Crawford's name for LGBTQ students pursuing military service, saying that her brother had wanted to serve his country and should be remembered for that desire rather than for the way his life had ended. The scholarship became a way of reclaiming James's memory and ensuring that his death, while tragic, could contribute to making military service safer and more inclusive for future generations of LGBTQ service members. The Family Feud episode featuring Arthur's confession became one of the most studied and debated pieces of television in recent history. It was used in ethics classes to discuss questions about confession, atonement, public versus private accountability, and whether some truths are better left buried. It was discussed in journalism ethics courses regarding the responsibility of media when someone confesses to a crime on air. It was analyzed by psychologists studying the long-term impact of guilt and the psychology of deathbed confessions. And it sparked broader conversations about how society should handle revelations of historical wrongdoing, whether there's value in acknowledging harm even decades after it occurred, and what it means to seek forgiveness for actions taken in a very different cultural context. Steve Harvey spoke about the experience frequently in the years that followed, calling it the most difficult and ethically complex situation he had ever faced as a host. He said that hearing Arthur's confession in real time, trying to figure out how to respond appropriately, and dealing with the aftermath had challenged him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He defended his decision to let Arthur finish his confession and to facilitate the meeting with Mary Crawford Thompson, arguing that while the situation was disturbing and uncomfortable, there was value in allowing Arthur to speak his truth and in giving James Crawford's family the information they had been denied for 7 decades. He also acknowledged the criticism that the show had provided a platform for someone to confess to effectively letting someone die, and he grappled publicly with whether that had been the right choice, or whether he should have shut down the confession immediately. The broader question of what responsibility television shows have when someone confesses to a crime became a topic of significant debate. Some argued that shows should have protocols in place to stop such confessions and direct people to proper legal channels, while others argued that public confession serves a valuable social function by allowing truth to be spoken and acknowledged even when legal prosecution isn't possible or appropriate. The Arthur Brennan case, as it became known, was cited in discussions about media ethics, legal obligations, and the role of entertainment platforms in facilitating serious conversations about justice, morality, and accountability. In the end, Arthur Brennan's confession on Family Feud became a story about the lifelong weight of guilt, the complicated nature of atonement, the question of whether it's ever too late to tell the truth, and the ways that historical injustices can echo across decades affecting multiple generations. It forced conversations about how gay soldiers were treated in the 1950s military, about the relationship between societal persecution and individual tragedies, and about what accountability looks like when it comes 72 years late. It highlighted the fact that behind historical statistics about suicide and military deaths are individual human stories of suffering, persecution, and failure, stories that often remain hidden because the people involved carry shame or guilt that prevents them from speaking. Arthur's story also raised uncomfortable questions about moral responsibility. Was he a murderer for watching James die and not helping? Or was he a young soldier in an impossible situation who made a terrible choice, but who spent the rest of his life trying to atone? Was his confession an act of courage, or an act of self-serving absolution? Did his decades of suicide prevention work and LGBTQ+ advocacy count as atonement? Or did nothing he did afterward matter compared to that initial choice to let James die? These questions had no easy answers, and different people came to different conclusions based on their own moral frameworks and beliefs about guilt, redemption, and justice. For James Crawford's family, Arthur's confession provided both closure and new pain. They finally understood what had happened to James, why he had felt driven to suicide, and that there had been a moment when he might have been saved. That knowledge was devastating, but also in some ways relieving, because it answered questions that had haunted them and provided context that made James's death more understandable. Mary's decision to forgive Arthur was personal and was not endorsed by all family members, but it represented her own choice about how to spend her remaining years and how to relate to the truth about her brother's death. For Arthur's family, the revelation shattered their understanding of who he was and forced them to reckon with loving someone who had done something horrific. They struggled with how to remember him after his death, how to honor the grandfather they had loved while acknowledging the terrible choice he had made as a young man. Some family members eventually came to see Arthur's confession as an act of courage that partially redeemed his earlier cowardice, while others felt that confessing on his deathbed was too little too late and didn't constitute real accountability. The family fractured and healed in different ways, with some members estranged and others finding ways to maintain connection while holding space for their complicated feelings. The story of Arthur Brennan and James Crawford became a permanent part of discussions about military history, LGBTQ persecution, suicide, confession, and atonement. It was a story that provided no clean resolution, no simple moral, and no easy answers. It was deeply uncomfortable, ethically complex, and emotionally devastating. But it was also a story that forced people to confront difficult truths about human nature, about the ways we fail each other, about the weight of guilt carried across lifetimes, and about whether truth, telling, even 72 years late, has value. Arthur died believing he had done the right thing by finally confessing, though he was never sure if his confession had brought him the peace he sought. Mary died believing that forgiveness had been the right choice for her, though she acknowledged that others in her position might have made different choices. And James Crawford, dead at 20 in 1953, was finally acknowledged not just as a suicide statistic, but as a young man who had been persecuted, who had suffered, and whose death might have been prevented if someone had chosen to help him instead of watching him die. The final footage of Arthur, recorded just days before his death, showed him saying, "I don't know if confessing helped James or his family, and I don't know if it earned me any forgiveness in this life or whatever comes next. But I know that carrying that secret was killing me slowly for 72 years, and speaking it aloud, as painful and awful as that was, at least meant I died having told the truth. I hope that wherever James is, if consciousness continues after death in any form, he knows that I'm sorry, that I've thought about him every day, and that I finally acknowledged what I did to him. That's all I have to offer, and I know it's not enough, but it's all I have."